In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at this now pretty much major hurricane. There is some dispute about what wind speed we have currently, but it sits somewhere around a Category 3 hurricane. Hurricane Helene. I think that's what you guys were telling me to call it. I'm having trouble saying that name for some reason, so if I say it differently every time, bear with me. I guess that's not the important point about the video, is whether I can pronounce it or not. It's more the information. But we're going to be taking a deep dive into this storm, obviously looking at the satellite imagery that we see now where an eye wall is developing, as you can tell. We're going to be taking a look at wind speed, storm surge, which I think will be the most major impact of this entire storm. We're going to be taking a look at total rainfall as well, and a whole lot of model guidance as this storm is imminently striking Florida. Impacts are starting now, so I'm going to try to race this video out for you guys so we can get some information to some people as quickly as possible. As we take a look at this storm, we see that there is a very, very decent eye wall on this thing. It's kind of wobbling around, as you can see, the actual eye of it. And that's because the eye is still developing. It's having trouble finding that exact spot of circulation in the very middle, but I do suspect that we will see, unfortunately, some really decent development as it's approaching the coast. We've kind of began to see some rapid intensification very recently, and unfortunately this storm is looking very, very impactful. We have this kind of buzzsaw look, as you can see, where we have these just kind of, it's not a good look, but when you see these bands kind of on the outside like this, it's just never a good thing. It's a sign of a very, very strong storm. And not only is this a very strong storm, I think something notable about this storm is that it's very large. I mean, it's almost the size of Florida, as you can see right next to it. So this is a massive storm, which honestly bodes well in development. Typically these larger storms have a harder time developing, and we have seen that take place with this storm so far. So I suspect that if it was smaller, this would have actually been an even worse storm. A little less far spread, but a little bit more intense, especially near the center of this storm. So there is a little bit of good news. The bad news is that the impacts do stretch further. So I guess it's, you know, on one hand a good thing, on the other a bad thing, but definitely an intense storm. We still see lightning popping off kind of outside of the center. We see kind of in these outer bands, which is fairly typical. We see some lightning in there as well. A big sign of development would be if we were getting lightning in the core of it, but we were earlier. We're starting to see a little less, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of that starts to pop up here soon. But unfortunately, like I mentioned, this storm is rapidly intensifying. Again, close to a Category 3, and probably going to end up as a Category 3 or 4 here by the time we see landfall. It would take a whole lot for it to intensify more than that, and nothing's impossible. And honestly, you know, the impacts are going to be devastating regardless. So let's talk about it. Let's dive into the model guidance. First off, here is your total precipitation. This is according to the HRRR model. I would typically use the NAM model, but the NAM model has been overdoing this storm every step of the way, showing a, you know, much stronger storm at every step than it ends up being. So we're going to deviate away from that one. The rainfall, thankfully, is going to be a little mild for what you might be used to, at least in Florida. Compared to, you know, typical hurricanes of this intensity. We're looking at maybe, you know, 5 to 10 inches in the very, very maximum in there. A lot of widespread 2 to 5 inches expected, which you can see in a more typical storm. So really, really good news there. I want to deviate us to a bigger view of the southeast, because there is some areas that are going to get a little more devastating rainfall, and that's going to be these Smoky Mountains here, as well as areas in here where we could be approaching 10 to 12 inches of rainfall. And for these very high elevations areas, these could be, you know, pretty impactful. We're seeing heavy rainfall track far inland from this system, but not only that, very strong winds actually are tracking that far inland as well. I'm going to take us back to our 12Z run, because this particular model does get out further if we do this. And when we look at the whole course of the storm, we can see even further precipitation in this area, especially for the Smoky Mountains of North Carolina here, where we're looking at 10 to 15 there in the blues, and we see some pinks popping up, which could be 15 to 20. So we're talking a foot and a half of rainfall for these mountains. Very bad news. I expect extreme flooding could be possible. We can see that a lot of this is from the main track of the storm, obviously. But we do get this kind of like deviated area as well of heavy precipitation tracking into Tennessee, Kentucky, and southern Illinois, southern Indiana. So a lot of areas being impacted by heavier rainfall, and the worst of the flooding could be for those Smoky Mountains, as I mentioned. As we take a look at the wind gust swath, so this is your highest winds as far as gusts, and then also it's the entire model run. So this isn't at a concurrent point. This is any time between now and the next 18 hours. And we are seeing in the greens 34 to 50 mile per hour gusts. The yellows and oranges will be about 50 to 60 mile per hour gusts. The reds will be 60 all the way up to about 70. That goes for these outer reds, by the way, not these inner pinkish reds. We'll talk about that in a minute. The browns are 70 to about 80 mile per hour gusts, and then those whites and reds, it's going to be 80 to 100 in the lighter pinks, and then as we get in the deeper reds, that's 100 to 124-ish mile per hour wind gusts. And I do think this is a little bit on the conservative side. I think we're going to get worse than this, just because the current storm's winds are above 100 miles per hour sustained. So I figure there will be worse gusts than that. Quickly, let's take a look here at this NAM 3KM model. Again, might be overdoing it a little bit, but we get a maximum of 60 in there, especially right near the core of the storm, which is fairly realistic. So we're seeing, a maximum of 160. We're seeing all of these kind of grayish areas seeing 130 plus mile per hour wind gusts. I think this wind at least is a little more realistic compared to that HRRR model, especially considering where we're already at. Speaking of where we're already at, let's take a look at the overall tropics. Not only do we have Helene here over the Gulf of Mexico and approaching Florida, but we also have tropical, well, let's update this. I think we have an update here. There we go. A little closer to Florida, we have Tropical Storm Isaac, which is taken off in the North Atlantic, far North Atlantic. We see this area of 90% chance of development there out in our MDR, which stands for Main Development Region, out there between Africa and the Eastern Caribbean. And then also we have a 20% chance of development right underneath Helene. Remember a couple of days ago when we were talking about a potential trailing tropical system right behind this one? Well, there it is. And there has been some model guidance showing this develop. So we're going to have to track that moving forward. And if it tracks towards the same track of Helene, which, by the way, a lot of systems do follow the stronger one like that, that would just be the icing on the cake and really, unfortunately, be salt in the wound, I guess, would be a better term there. Icing on the cake, I feel like sounds like a good thing, but salt in the wound here. The people impacted by this major hurricane could be seeing more storminess behind it at the very least, which is just not needed, of course. Here is your cone forecast for Hurricane Helene. Again, no deviations really expected from this. We're really expecting it to hit the northern end of that big bend of Florida. We have hurricane warnings up in all the reds. The blues are tropical storm warnings. So even on the east coast of South Carolina, some tropical storm warnings are around, as we will get some winds coming on shore all the way on the east coast. Again, this is a very, very large storm, so we can expect far-stretching impacts, unfortunately. And this storm is expected to curve to the west, again, towards Tennessee and Kentucky. Some of that rainfall on the eastern end will track into the Appalachian Mountain Range, though. The north and east side of this storm seem to be the worst expected impacts, of course, like most of these systems are. Tropical Storm Isaac is expected to become Hurricane Isaac by 8 a.m. on Saturday, before returning to tropical storm status as it actually approaches kind of like the southern European area, like Portugal and Spain, perhaps, as a post-tropical storm. So that could bring some impacts for them. Of course, we don't usually do European weather, but that could be interesting. Definitely some rainfall for them. I don't know if they need it or not, but again, don't keep up to date with European weather very much. But interesting to see an Atlantic hurricane impacting them. It does happen from time to time. I guess not a hurricane by that point, but a tropical system regardless. Now, as we look at our hurricane models, here is this one, the HAFSA model. And we do see that this one has us around 151 mile per hour wind gusts. So it is gusts, by the way, as this one approaches the coast of Florida. And we see well into the 60s and 70s here for the Tampa Bay area, and really everywhere south of that Big Bend anywhere to the north of or in the Tampa Bay area. So everywhere in between those two regions does expect to see 60, 70, maybe even 80, 90 mile per hour wind gusts. Very, very unfortunate. And again, we talk about the major storm surge for the Tampa Bay area. It's because these winds are pushing everything on shore like this. That's why the storm surge is expected to be the worst on the eastern end of the storm. Of course, these areas on the west, we see winds are headed to the south here, wrapping around the system. So it makes sense that the eastern end is where we see the worst of those impacts. As we get this storm on shore, we still see, 90 to 100 mile per hour, upwards of even 125 mile per hour wind gusts all the way a couple counties inland in Florida and even into Georgia. Look at this, 90 to 100 plus mile per hour wind gusts in southern Georgia. And even as we're approaching the South Carolina area, we're still seeing wind gusts in the 80s and 90s here. So that's why these tropical storm and hurricane warnings extend so far inland today. You might have noticed that is because these devastating winds. Look at the Smoky Mountains, 70 to 80 mile per hour wind gusts in those Smoky Mountain areas that expect a foot plus of rainfall. This could be a devastating storm for them when you combine the flooding and the wind that they expect to see from this system. This is going to be a big time wind and rainmaker for areas far inland. A lot of people are not suspecting or expecting these impacts, I suspect, but it is on the way, unfortunately. And as we take a look at this one's sister model, we get almost identical outlook here. Very strong winds inshore. Let's take a look at a completely different model. This is HWRF, another hurricane model, and this one keeps us at about 137 mile per hour wind gusts as this one's approaching the coast. We do get, wind gusts in the 40s, 50s, and 60s inland, but it really dies down. But we're still seeing some signs of 50s and 60s there around those Smoky Mountains, which would be devastating enough. As we mentioned, it doesn't have to be, at hurricane wind levels like 70 plus would be. As we take a look at our final hurricane model, the HMON model, we see this one is very similar. We see about 139 mile per hour wind gusts as this one's approaching the Big Bend. And again, all of these winds heading northward. Fortunately, this one is really keeping that swirl kind of moving offshore for a lot of these areas. I think it's mostly after this storm has moved in. Look at this. We see these wind gusts pushing it straight into the Tampa Bay area, straight on shore of the Big Bend in multiple areas. But again, the winds are heading southward for a lot of these areas on the western end. So that is the overall flow here. We see that once it moves on shore, it's a lot less impactful than even our previous model, so we'll be hoping for this outcome, of course. Here's that peak storm surge forecast. Now we expect 15 to 20 feet of storm surge for areas like Apalachicola, Carabella, if that's how you say that, Sewanee River area. So I know a lot of these areas aren't the biggest, but these are nevertheless areas that do have some population and some beautiful beaches. And this is 15 to 20 foot of storm surge. That's unbelievable. I was looking at a chart. I'm not going to show it today. I lost it. I found it on, it was something from the National Weather Service. Somebody had basically taken the record storm surges for a lot of these areas along the west coast of Florida and the Panhandle, and they're comparing what's expected from the National Hurricane Center to their records. And a lot of areas are seeing feet and feet above their record most storm surge, including the Tampa Bay area, including a lot of the Big Bend. This could be a devastating scenario here. As we move southward, we see the red areas are about 8 to 12 feet of storm surge. The Tampa Bay area, 5 to 8 feet of storm surge. I think their record was like 4 or 5 feet. So we're looking at potentially around that, if not up to double it for these areas, which could be completely devastating. I saw that the what area was it to the south of there? Fort Myers, Florida, already had flooding in the streets. I saw videos today, and that's an area that's expecting far less impacts, and it's much further away from the middle of the storm, but even they're seeing major storm surge flooding already. So imagine up the Tampa Bay and up the Big Bend. I mean, that's a bad sign. Areas in the yellows, we're expecting up to 6 feet of storm surge, and then the blues is up to 3 feet. So, and look at the East Coast. Storm surge for the East Coast of Florida, East Coast of Georgia, and the coast of South Carolina. I mean, absolutely incredible. This huge storm bringing these impacts far and wide. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope everybody stays safe. Obviously, this will likely be my final outlook for this storm as it's expected later this evening into tonight. Be sure to subscribe. We do upload every single day, and we will keep you guys up to date with all future systems here, hopefully for years to come. So subscribe, hit the bell icon for daily notifications when we upload so you never miss one. Like the video if you enjoyed it, leave a comment down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.